Today we're going to start Unit 3, which begins with the French and Indian War, which creates this empire for the British and expands the conflict between the colonies and the British. And then the last part of time period 3 extends into 1800s. So we will fight the Revolutionary War, we'll start the new nation, we'll create a new constitution and a new form of government. There's a lot happening in Unit 3. But we're going to get started with that today with the last section of chapter 4. So your book doesn't really divide it in the way that the College Board does, but that's okay because we're putting it together along with that time period. Let's start with time period or section 4.4, which begins Unit 3. Actually, hang on, I need to do one other thing when I share. Make sure that we get sound. Okay, so again, look at the time period. I would make note of that, 1754 to 1800. Usually when College Board, when you look at a set of dates for the ends and beginning of a unit, there are certain critical events that occur there. 1754, that's a date you probably should remember so that you can anchor different documents when you come across them and read them. If you know that 1754 is when the French and Indian War began, that really is a good place for you to start in trying to contextualize or understand the importance of certain documents. And then the end point, 1800, that's going to be the election of Thomas Jefferson. And that's when we transition the power of the government from one political party to another. So those are two important dates as we move forward. We see in this early period, 1750 to 1763, that there's a lot of conflict between the British and the French in Europe, and that ends up spilling over into the colonies. And that's what we're going to focus on first, is that struggle, that fight for power, European power, that becomes a global war. We think about World War I. Really, that was not the first World War. We had other world wars where there were fights among the European powers on multiple continents, and the French and Indian War is one of those. Three different developments are going to really kind of fuel this fire that leads into war, which first, like I said, this conflict between Great Britain and France is ongoing. We've also got more production by the colonists themselves. They're able to produce more goods, they're selling more items, and they begin to import more finished products from England, and they're buying it on credit. So there's debt owed by the colonists to the British merchants. And then as the population continues to grow in the colonies because of economic opportunity and just natural increase in the population, people start to move to the West. They feel that this is an outlet for them where they can get land that's cheaper, where the aristocrats in these cities, these early areas where the colonies were first formed, have kind of dominated all of the best land along that coastline. So as more people move west, you've got conflict with natives, you've got a discussion about, well, whose colony owns this land, or what colony is this land part of? And none of that has really been sorted out yet. So those are the three main developments that erupt into this war. And it's got three different names: French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, and then the Great War for Empire. Three names, all the same conflict. But if you look at the dates, 1754 to 1763, that's more than 7 years. The 7 years part of this is the time that it was fought in Europe. Okay, so it begins here in the colonies in North America, and then it spills over into Europe. So the 7 Years' War is the name that we would refer to this conflict in the part that was being fought in Europe. Okay, but collectively, you'll often hear it referred to as either the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War. The new term, the Great War for Empire, has become more common among historians, but I just wanted you to be familiar that they're all the same. This map shows us where things stand at the time of the conflict. And if we look at the breakdown of who's claiming what, we've got some disputed territory. The French absolutely have the most territory that they claim, but they have the smallest population. If you'll remember, they're just the fur traders that are spread out into the wilderness, and they're trading with the native groups and sending those the animal fur back to Europe. This is the more heavily populated area that the British control along the east coast of North America. And then all of this that's striped is disputed land. Okay, even up here as we get into what today we would refer to as Canada, that's also disputed. But the main source of this explosion is right here in and around the Ohio River Valley. Very fertile land, a lot of rivers to transport goods. And this was an area that both Great Britain and France wanted to control for themselves. Now, we've still got Spain over here in the Southwest. Spain also controls Florida, although there is some area along the border there that is disputed between Great Britain and Spain as well. Okay, so here we've got where this all erupts and how George Washington gets into the situation. The Ohio Company was a group of investors. We've talked about joint stock companies where groups of people will pool their money together in a risky sort of investment. The Ohio Company is one of those types of companies where you've got investors that are putting their money together, and they're moving out to the west, and they're taking land, claiming it for the company, and then carving it up into smaller lots of land that they then turn around and resell to settlers who are wanting to move out for opportunity. George Washington's half-brothers were investors, primary investors in the Ohio Company. So that's how he kind of gets involved in this situation, is the connection with his brothers. And he's also got great ambition. Now, by trade, George Washington had apprenticed as a surveyor, where if you buy or sell a house today, you're probably going to get a survey of that land, and they go out and they map the land, and then they put pins in the property line, where the boundary is between you and your neighbors. My neighbors did that over the summer. They're building a new like garage, detached garage or something, and they needed to know where the property line was to get the permit to build this, big structure that they're going to build. So one day there were people out here, and they had these flags, and they were staking it in the ground. Well, they had surveyed the land, so they knew exactly where the boundary was, and they were marking it off. So if you've got this company that is going out and claiming land for itself, it would be important to understand the boundaries of that land. So that's where George Washington is noticed by the governor of Virginia. Okay, his name is Governor Dinwiddie. He's the royal governor of Virginia at the time. And he will hire George Washington to represent the state, the colony of Virginia, to go out and claim the territory for the Ohio Company, which was a Virginia-based company, to go and claim that for the investors who were all very wealthy, powerful Virginians. So George Washington thinks that this is a great opportunity. He really doesn't want to be a surveyor for the rest of his life. He has great ambition of being an officer in the British Army. Now, keep in mind that this is still during the colonial period. You've got the Redcoat Army. This is the grand military of Great Britain. And George Washington aspires to become a leader in that army. This was his opportunity to make a name for himself among the elite aristocrats who were politically connected to the crown back in England. The governor of Virginia was the royal governor there. If George Washington does a good job, Governor Dinwiddie's going to put in a good word for him with the British, and then maybe he's going to get this commission to become an officer. So there's a lot going on here with George Washington's involvement. So Washington heads out to this area that's disputed. Here's the Ohio River. Here's the Allegheny River, which we would think of today with Pennsylvania. There's Virginia, and then the Great Lakes. So this is all in this Western territory where nobody really knows who's in control. The French understand that more colonists from the British colonies are moving out into this area, and they want to protect their claims, even though they don't have a large population. So the French have built a series of forts. Look at this one in particular right here. Fort Duquesne, it's spelled kind of funny, but Fort Duquesne right here, looks like it's pronounced Duquesne, but it's not, it's Duquesne. Fort Duquesne is a French fortification that's right here at the mouth of the Allegheny River and the Ohio River, which would be a very important trading center for the French, but the British also want it as well. So that's when Washington shows up, and the French aren't expecting it. He's able to have a little bit of early success, but then the French refortify themselves and they force George Washington out, and it's just a complete disaster. He makes this small little fortification called Fort Necessity out of necessity to try to protect themselves. They are overrun by the French and they have to run and retreat back to Virginia. So overall, George Washington's efforts here in this early part of the French and Indian War were not impressive. And the British are going to remember that. So keep in mind that this attack is what launches this worldwide conflict, and George Washington is right in the middle of it. Now, you also have natives who are involved here, and the natives have a long memory. The natives, especially these Iroquois tribes, the Iroquois were the ones who were targeted by Samuel de Champlain in the early era of New France, where he had helped the Algonquin tribes near Lake Champlain in Quebec against their rivals, the Iroquois. Well, the Iroquois remember that. So they're going to team up more with the British against the French to start with. All right, there's George Washington in the French and Indian War. Notice that he's wearing that bright red coat, and he's going to be involved here. Now, at the time, he looks older in this painting than he probably was. He was only 22 at the point that he was sent by Governor Dinwiddie to claim this land for Virginia. Look at the territory. So he's gone from Williamsburg, which would have been the colonial seat of power at that time in Virginia. He's come up here to Fort Duquesne. He's got this militia group of a couple hundred people with him, and it does not work out very well in this early era. I want to show you a film clip. This is from a good PBS movie called The War That Made America. It's all about the French and Indian War. And I want to show you this 10-minute clip that is about Washington's involvement and this early escalation and how the natives were involved here.
The French already control Canada and the Great Lakes region. By building a string of outposts through the Ohio country, they could link their French forts in Canada with their Louisiana colony and keep the British bottled up on the East Coast. A memorandum by the Marquis de la Galissonière, governor of New France, urges action. If the rapid progress of the English colonies be not arrested, they will possess in a short time formidable armaments on the continent of America. And if that happens, warns the Marquis, then all the other French colonies will fall to the British as well. La Galissonière was a visionary. He saw that the struggle for North America had global implications. If the French lost, France would be weakened in Europe as well. For Britain, the stakes were just as high. If it allowed France to dominate the Ohio country, the British colonies could never expand westward. So British authorities send an expedition to order the French to withdraw from the Ohio country. The man they picked to lead it? None other than the 21-year-old Virginian, George Washington. Washington is a natural choice. Brimming with ambition, imposingly tall, he is well-connected and eager to make a name for himself. Washington draws his own map of the journey that will take him past the forks of the Ohio to Fort Le Boeuf near Lake Erie, a 500-mile journey that gets underway just as winter sets in. Along the route, Washington comes to a French base. The officer in charge gives a warm welcome to the young Virginian. But the French make it very clear they won't give in to his ultimatum.
That night, he invited us to sup with them. Soon, the wine, which they dosed themselves with freely, loosened their tongues.
With utmost charm, the officer lets you know the sentiment among the French in the region.
They told us that it was their absolute design to take possession of the Ohio, and by God, they would do it. For, though the English could raise 2 men to their 1, they knew our actions were too slow to prevent any undertaking of theirs.
Brushed off by the French, Washington starts back to Virginia in December 1753. His report on the mission goes all the way to London, where King George II hears of the young Virginian who had done his best, but failed to persuade the French to leave the Ohio Valley. The following spring, the Virginians take up the Half-King's offer to build a trading post at the forks of the Ohio. But it's not to be. Almost immediately, French troops forced the Virginians to surrender the forks and abandon their unfinished building. The Half-King is furious. By taking the forks, the French have humiliated him, and the inability of the English to fight back makes him look like he's backed the losing side. He calculates how to get even. It's the young George Washington who unwittingly offers him that chance. That's how Washington came to ambush the French, his first taste of battle. That same spring of 1754, Washington is on his way back to the forks with orders to help the Virginians finish their trading post. When he learns he is too late, he makes plans to confront the French and take the forks back. The Half-King agrees to be his ally. But Washington doesn't realize that the Indian leader has a complicated agenda of his own. If the Half-King orchestrates a confrontation between the British and the French, it will strengthen his own hand in the region. But why does the Half-King go further and kill the wounded Frenchman? It's an act of revenge for his humiliation at the forks, and a message to the French to back off. And he knows the blame will fall on George Washington, not himself.
Tu n'es pas encore mort, mon père.
You are not dead yet, my father, says the Half-King. An ironic twist to the respectful term the Indians usually use for their French allies. Washington's skirmish alone probably would not have triggered a larger war. But the cold-blooded murder of their wounded officer, the French couldn't possibly let that go without a response. Within weeks, the brother of the slain Ensign Jumonville sets off in pursuit. Meanwhile, Washington has withdrawn his men to a large meadow. They build a crude stockade that the Virginians wryly name Fort Necessity. Washington expects the Half draft king to help defend the fort. But the Indian leader has lost confidence in the young major.
There's Washington. He is a good-natured man, but he has no experience. Always driving us to fight by his direction. And now he wants us to make a stand with him against the French. And that little thing upon the meadow.
Washington's only Indian ally leaves.
We have no choice. We will make our stand here.
The French have no such problems with their native allies. They arrive accompanied by 100 Shawnee, Mingo, and Delaware warriors.
About 9 o'clock on the 3rd of July, the enemy advanced with shouts and dismal Indian yells.
Washington intends to fight face-to-face in the field, European style. But the French and their Indian allies don't cooperate.
They then, from every little rising tree, bush, stump, and stone, kept up a golden, constant fire, which we returned as best we could. Till late in the afternoon, when there fell the most tremendous rain that can be conceived. Filled our trenches with water and wet not only the ammunition and the firelocks, but also the few stores that we had, leaving us only a few bayonets for defense.
By nightfall, the situation is hopeless. When the French commander offers terms for surrender, Washington signs the soggy document. Unable to read French, he relies on a Dutch officer to translate. It turns out that Jumonville's brother is taking a sweet revenge. Washington doesn't learn until later that the document includes a confession to the assassination of Ensign Jumonville. The morning after the battle, the victorious French allowed Washington to retreat towards Virginia with his wounded and tattered troops. Word of his defeat spread quickly. This was not the kind of fame the young Washington had been seeking. The date, oddly enough, was the 4th of July, 1754.
So here's George Washington's fort. This is a replica that they have created here on the site. From that film, I think you get a sense of that there were a large series of mistakes by George Washington in this early attack of the French. He learns from that. When they talked about that the French were attacking at the fort and they were lined up in the traditional European manner and the French weren't going to do that, they were hiding from behind trees. George Washington learns from that. That's going to be one of the styles, one of the strategies that he uses against the British later on in the Revolutionary War. The issue with the natives, he has the ally would like nothing better than to have the French and the British defeat one another and force them all out of the territory. So that's why he takes that officer who's wounded and kills him on purpose, knowing that George Washington's going to catch the blame. And then that last little segment, you may have picked up on the fact that the agreement, the settlement to negotiate the end of this fight out here in the Ohio River Valley was written in French, and his translator didn't necessarily give him the whole story. And in the document, George Washington accepts full responsibility for the assassination of Jumonville, the French officer. So this was not George Washington's best military effort, but he learns from it. And he's going to use those lessons very skillfully in the war against the British. Okay, so Washington surrenders. The French and Indian War is now on, and it's going to become a worldwide war. Okay, so here is a map of, I'm going to show you a series of maps here that is showing the American colonies at the time of 1754. If you look right here, you've got the Iroquois located, this is Iroquois territory. They are right in between the English colonies and the French colonies. And they're going to use that position of being in the middle to their advantage. They're going to play one side against the other, like we just saw in this situation with Fort Necessity and Fort Duquesne under George Washington. Okay, so that Iroquois tribe is right there in the middle. And notice that they are subjects of Great Britain. So again, this is going to be the group that is aligned with the English, where the other natives of the region are aligned with the French. Well, during the French and Indian War, they're going to use that. They're going to say, you need us in this fight, therefore we need this, 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 and this. And they're going to become well supplied and well equipped by the British. Okay, so the boundary is what's in dispute, this colonial territory and Indian territory. So the English colonies, again, are in red, the French are here, and the fighting now breaks out, okay? So the borders are going to differ a little bit, okay? Where you've got the establishment of more territory out here in the West. Benjamin Franklin is now going to step onto the scene as one of the great diplomats, or one of the great leaders of the English colonies at the time. He's in Philadelphia, and he is going to bring groups of representatives from the various colonies together in something called the Albany Congress. And I would emphasize that in your notes. We're going to spend time looking at these documents in class. But I'm going to have them here so that when you go back and watch this, you can reread them. But we're going to do the more detailed analysis of these documents in class. But when he has this Albany Congress, where delegates from the various colonies meet together, he is going to float the idea for union. And we call this the Albany Plan for Union. So this is Benjamin Franklin's idea about colonies working together as a unit. Okay, you've got the Iroquois representative who's there as well. So that's going to be the purpose for this early meeting, is to try to make sure that everybody's on the same page with the Iroquois and the English colonists. So again, this is another document that we're going to be reading in class, but I've put it here in case you want to go back and reread that and look at it as you review. So this is the Iroquois speaker who's talking about the conflict between the British and the French and where they stand as people who are caught in the middle of it. So in the Albany Congress, what Franklin is looking for, bottom line, when he arrives there, is to restore the relationship with the Iroquois. The British know they have to have an Indian ally if they have any chance of success. And they're also going to be unifying the various colonies, or trying to. And the meeting is called by the British Board of Trade. So this is about the colonies and their efforts for trade. And then the chief of the Mohawks, this is him who is representing the Iroquois at the meeting. Now, there are other natives who go there, but he's going to be the main speaker. Notice that he's dressed in a red coat. He's got elements of his English tie. And he's also got the tomahawk here, which is representing his native side. So again, this is showing that blend of the two. All right, this is the chart that we also will be doing in class, where we're looking at the three parties involved. What do they want to achieve at this meeting, the Albany Congress? What do the colonists want? What do the natives want? What do the British leaders who are there? What do they all want out of this meeting? And who do they have conflicts with, and why? Okay, so what is their issue with the other folks who are involved? Okay, this cartoon is one that is very, very important. This is one of the earliest political cartoons that come out of what becomes the United States. And this is a Benjamin Franklin cartoon. And notice what he is saying, join or die. Notice the year 1754. This would be the time of the outbreak of the French and Indian War, and it's the year that the Albany Congress is meeting. And you've got this snake, New England. So the head of the snake here, where the leadership of the colonies and the merchant class and the economic center of the United States is beginning to form here in New England. Then you've got the middle colonies. Here's P for Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. And then you have those southern colonies. Now, Georgia was brand new at the time. They had only been a colony for maybe 10, 15 years or so at that point. So they were not really thought of as being as critical. So Franklin in this cartoon, in this join or die cartoon, you want to, again, always think about historical situation, intended audience, purpose, and point of view. The historical situation here is the conflict between Great Britain and France that prompts him to make this cartoon. So his intended audience would be the colonies themselves. He wants those colonies, so his purpose here is for the colonies to unify and work together as a unit rather than working against each other. So part of the conflict over claims in the Ohio country is between Virginia and Pennsylvania. Both of them are claiming the same land. So he's saying, don't work against each other. We have to work together as a unit. Now, when he floats this idea almost of an alliance of sorts between the colonies at the Albany Congress, things are not yet bad enough for the colonists to be willing to join together in some sort of unified continental government. They're afraid that if they do that, they're going to lose their own independence and their own autonomy as a colony, which was part of the reason why most of the colonies were founded in the first place, was to govern themselves in the way that they would like. This was not an idea that was popular in the 1750s, but by the 1770s, a whole lot will happen between 1754 and 1776 that will cause the colonists to change their mind and say, you know what, maybe we should join up together and unify as a group of colonies who are working together against the British. So here's the Albany Plan. Benjamin Franklin again proposes the idea. He wants a general government of the colonies where there's still going to be independent colonies, but they're going to have a continental government that would be responsible for these key issues. Trade. Instead of trading and competing with one another, they're going to trade as a unit, getting higher prices, getting better prices for goods that they're importing. To manage Indian policies rather than George Washington representing the governor of Virginia on his own and making a mess of these relationships, there needs to be some sort of unified approach to handling the native policy. And then defending the colonies themselves, okay? So the Albany Plan is proposed, but it was never accepted. But it's important because this is the first attempt that we see of the idea of unification being floated about among the colonists. There are people in England who would much prefer that war take place and to claim more of this territory in North America for the British. William Pitt is going to be leading the way there. We'll talk about William Pitt later, but he is going to be someone in Parliament who is responsible for American affairs for England. And he is supporting a war with France. He believes it's worth it. He doesn't believe that the French will be willing to fight a prolonged war over territory that's not heavily populated. He was wrong. It's going to last a while and spread worldwide, but William Pitt is going to be really trying to work in favor of the colonies here. Once the war is over and Fort Duquesne is reclaimed, so there's Fort Duquesne again, it's reclaimed by the British. So notice here that there's an X. There's going to ultimately be a British victory here. Later in the 1750s, they rename Fort Duquesne, they rename it Fort Pitt. And today we would call it Pittsburgh. That's where we get the city of Pittsburgh, which is right around the location that Fort Duquesne was. back during this colonial time. Here are the details of the war. The war in Europe was 7 years, begins in 1756, and it's a world war. We've got all of these European powers who are taking sides. The British are going to have alliances with Prussia, which is kind of the precursor to Germany, but it's more of all of those German principalities together. And then France and Spain are working together with Austria. And then the natives, again, are going to switch sides. This is where the British commander, General Braddock, in the heavy fighting at Fort Duquesne, he is killed there. And this is a pretty famous painting of the killing of General Braddock. And that was devastating to the English forces because he was one of their strongest commanders. There's William Pitt. Again, he believes that there will be advantages if these lands in North America are in the hands of the British. Okay? So he uses that to again claim victory around the world, and England now becomes an empire. So sometimes this is referred to as the war for empire. They have now achieved an empire, not just in North America and Europe, but they've also been fighting in other areas in the Caribbean and South America and in other locations, and end up taking property. The treaty that ends the war, so the French lose the war, the British are going to win, and the outcome, the negotiated settlement, is called the Treaty of Paris. And here are the provisions in the Treaty of Paris. You've got the transfer of land. Notice that essentially the French are removed from North America. They do maintain control of a few small islands in the Caribbean, but for the most part, the French are out. All of this land now becomes the territory of the British. So this is when Canada becomes a British possession. It still is, but this is when it happens. Notice Florida down here. Spain loses control of Florida and it goes over to the British. This is because Spain had been an ally of France, okay? So the boundary now becomes the Mississippi River. So hopefully that's clear, that Treaty of Paris, 1763. So the colonists, they believe that they have been instrumental in the victory that the British have won here. And they believe that now there's all of this open land. And if you didn't have a large plot of land of your own, now you've got more opportunity in the West. But hang on just a second, because the Indians were not part of the negotiations of the Treaty of Paris. That would have been British leaders, that would have been French leaders, but the Indians were not represented in the negotiation. And this was a terrible, terrible day for the natives. They would much prefer the French to still be in possession of all of this territory because they were left alone. They didn't have to worry about large populations of Europeans coming in and taking their land. As long as they were trading with the Europeans, they had a pretty good situation. They were able to get weapons, they were able to get food and tools and metals and all of those types of things that they wanted, and it didn't cost them their way of life or their communities. So the natives want the French not to give up so easily because they look at this map and they don't believe that there's any way in the world that the British can maintain control of all of this territory. So they would prefer to show the French that the British are not able to hang on, and they pick a fight with the Americans who are moving out there. And they're doing this to try to lure the French to come back. So we call this Pontiac's War or Pontiac's Rebellion. So Chief Pontiac is going to get various tribes. All of these tribes that are listed in green are going to come together under the leadership of Chief Pontiac to fight back against the British in an effort to show the French, British can't hang on, please, please, please come back. The British aren't willing to fight. This war had been incredibly expensive. When you were fighting a continent away, across the ocean, it was incredibly expensive to be able to fight this war. And the British were not able to fend off the natives. The French were not willing to get back involved because they'd lost so much money as well. And so the natives now are in a bad way. The best that the British can do, because they know that they can't afford an ongoing conflict with the natives, is they pass a law. So the war ends in 1763. The Treaty of Paris is negotiated 1763. And on the heels of that, when Pontiac's Rebellion breaks out, there's going to be a law passed by the British Parliament directly aimed at all of the colonies. And it's called the Proclamation of 1763. So star that in your notes. You've got the Treaty of Paris in 1763. You've got the end of the French and Indian War, and you've got the Proclamation of 1763. And this is going to establish an imaginary line that the colonists, the British colonists, are not allowed to cross. The last thing that the British want are more fights with natives in this territory to the west. So the Proclamation line, as we call it, is right here in green along the ridge of the Appalachian Mountains, basically. And the Proclamation line is an invisible boundary that the colonists aren't allowed to pass. They're furious. They believe it was because of them that the British have won. Why would they not be able to enjoy the spoils of victory or the land that was acquired in the war? How dare the British tell them this? So this is the first of a long series of conflicts or policies that come down by the British that will anger the colonists and head them on this path towards war. Okay, now, can the British really patrol all of this territory? No, there's no way that they can patrol it all at one time and prevent the colonists from going out to the west. But it angers the colonists nonetheless. The colonists are also deeply in debt. They had put their livelihood on hold to fight in this war. So Great Britain is deeply in trouble financially. The colonists are indebted to the British merchants. They were buying things on credit. And so Great Britain has enormous debt from the war. You've got no way of generating revenue because your colonies are not producing as much as they once were because they've been caught up in this war. So financially, England is in very, very big trouble. There's also fighting that breaks out in the backcountry. We mentioned the backcountry meaning more of that frontier area of the colonies. 3 different areas of rebellion at about the same time between the end of the French and Indian War in 1766. These 3 groups of people are frontiersmen in their various colonies who are fighting against and rallying against the control that the aristocrats have in the government and in the economics of their colony. The first and probably the most famous of the groups would be the Paxton Boys, also in 1763. So here are the Paxton Boys, and they are Scots-Irish. So these are some of those immigrants that had come into the colonies and had settled in the backcountry. And they wanted help with the Indians. They were on the frontier. They go to the government in Philadelphia, and the colonial government's like, sorry, we're not going to be able to help with that, because part of it is that they still have that Quaker foundation, that pacifist philosophy where war or fighting is not going to be that type of solution. And the Paxton Boys said, well, we're going to take care of it ourselves. So they go into the frontier, they kill 20 or so Indians, and then the colonial government is furious. And so the governor there puts them on trial, these Paxton Boys, puts them on trial. And then more of the frontiersmen are coming into Philadelphia and they're ready to riot. It's almost the same situation that we had much, much earlier in Virginia. Do you remember that rebellion in Virginia, where the people living on the outskirts of town were begging for help from the colonial government? And the government was like, no, we're good. We don't want to pick a fight with the natives. And then they took it into their own hands. That was Bacon's rebellion in Virginia. So now you've got a similar situation in the 1760s with the Paxton Boys, okay? Ultimately, Benjamin Franklin gets involved here. He diffuses the situation. But the key importance here is it highlights this difference of of life in the backcountry versus the more settled areas in the urban areas, and how these settlers are not going to stand for being considered second-class citizens. Okay, then you've got the regulators of South Carolina. The regulators are going to be doing the same thing. The regulators in North Carolina are going to be doing the same things. These are people, backcountry farmers, who have lost their land to the aristocrats in the East, and they're demanding action. They are demanding a voice in the government. So this sets that foundation that will become one of the important tenets of the United States when it forms. Now that we've got the problems of the French and Indian War out of the way, now we need to look at this path that will lead the colonies to declare independence from Great Britain. And it all starts as a result of the conflict in the French and Indian War. So join or die. We're going to keep coming back to this, that in 1754 at the Albany Congress, the colonists weren't yet ready to declare independence. They still viewed themselves as Englishmen. They were proud to be English citizens and loyal to the king and all of that. That changes over the course of the next couple of decades. One term that is critical for you to remember is salutary neglect. Salutary neglect is where, as long as the colonies were providing financial support or resources to England, they were kind of left to do their own thing politically within the colonies. Each of the colonies had their own legislature of sorts where they would make local decisions. They taxed themselves locally without a whole lot of interference from the British crown. Yes, there were royal governors, but at the time, those royal governors were paid by, like the House of Burgesses in Virginia. Those burgesses determined the salary that the royal governor would be given. The courts were all funded by, and the judges were all funded by the colonial government. So really, it was kind of an autonomous system where the colonies were left on their own. When that comes to an end is at the end of the French and Indian War because of the incredible debt that they are in. Look at this map. So what I find every year is that kids often have a hard time reading graphs and charts. In red, we have how much money the British were spending on war, okay? So if we come over here, there are some spikes in the spending in the war. By the time of the French and Indian War, this is by far the most money that the British have ever had to spend on a war, because they're fighting not in Europe, they're fighting in North America and all over the world. So this is the debt that they have incurred. This is how much money they have spent on the war, but look what they are bringing in tax income in green. So there's no way for this to actually match up. So they are in deep trouble. And the British government's going to say, you know what? I think it's time for those colonists to pay for their own protection. The British government in England, in London, is looking at the spoils of the French and Indian War, all that land that was acquired, that it was actually benefiting the colonists. Therefore, they should be paying the bulk of this money that is going to pay down that debt. Okay, if you've ever had little brothers and little sisters, and they are allowed to, I don't know, maybe if you go and you babysit and they've, actually, let me change my example here. Let's say that I don't have a policy related to late work, homework being turned in or something like that. And for months, I allow you just to turn stuff in whenever. And all of a sudden I come back and I say, now we're going to have this policy put in place. It's going to be really difficult for me to get control of that situation after so long of allowing students to do whatever they wanted to do. That's sort of what salutary neglect is. This is a period of time where the colonies are left to do their own thing. There's very little oversight by the British government. As long as they're providing the resources to England, the king really didn't care a whole lot. But now the king is trying to get control and tax these colonists, and they're not going to have it. All right, so that's going to lead to some of the trouble here. So these are some of the new taxes that are put in place. The prime minister is George Grenville. The king is George III. Now, the structure of the government, we've got that constitutional monarchy that was created during the Glorious Revolution when William and Mary were brought in after the crown was restored, right? So we bring in William and Mary, and that was part of the agreement. They're going to be made the monarchs as long as you've got this oversight and more power given to Parliament. And part of that is the prime minister. So the prime minister is really going to be operating the day-to-day decision-making of England, where the king is more of this figurehead. Now, ultimately, the king is in charge and has to agree to who the prime minister is, but it's a split of the responsibility. So George Grenville, he comes in to office as prime minister right at the end of the French and Indian War. And so he has a mess on his hands. He has got to try to sort out this massive debt that England is faced with. And he does so through a series of laws that we're going to be looking at that are intended to generate money for England. First is the Currency Act, and the Currency Act is where the British say that the colonists can no longer trade or pay for things with paper money. Each of the colonies had their own currency that they had just been trading these pieces of paper, and it was of value in the colonies. George Grenville says, nope, we've got to go back to the gold and silver. We're not going to be accepting currency from the colonies anymore. The Sugar Act is another one where there had been a tax placed on sugar, right? Molasses is you make molasses from sugar. It's more or less like a liquid sugar. And so there had previously been a tax in place that was 6 pennies per pound of molasses, but it was never enforced. The tax collectors, again, were all paid their salaries by the local legislatures. And so it was kind of an agreement where they would kind of turn the other way. Oh, you're importing molasses? I didn't know about that, so I didn't collect the tax. The new tax that's put in place in 1764, again, look at the date. This is after the end of the French and Indian War. So when that French and Indian War is over, they're going to replace this 30-year-old sugar tax on molasses that's been ignored the entire time. People have smuggled in whatever they wanted, never paid the tax. George Grenville lowers the tax to 3 pennies per pound of molasses or sugar, but he's actually going to enforce it. He's going to send more tax collectors. He's going to monitor it. So when the colonists start complaining, oh my gosh, no taxation without representation, we don't have members of parliament, we don't vote, we don't elect anybody there, George Grenville's going to say, well, what do you mean? I'm actually lowering the taxes. You should be happy about that. And the colonists, if they start saying, but we never paid it in the first place, then they're admitting to smuggling in items without paying the appropriate taxes that had been in place. So that was pretty clever there on George Grenville's part, was the Sugar Act. The Quartering Act is another part of this. Grenville believes that if there's got to be more British soldiers out in the West patrolling and protecting the frontier from natives and also protecting from the British. Now, here's another little caveat to the story. The British soldiers never fully left the western frontier area of North America. Those British soldiers are still out there. The French soldiers are still out there, right? If those British soldiers are still out there, they've got to be kept there. They've got to have supplies. They've got to have food. They've got to have protection and military equipment and on and on and on. Well, that's expensive. And so Grenville believes, well, the colonies should be paying for that. So the Quartering Act in 1765 says that the colonies have to provide money for the upkeep of the military. Okay, not terribly unfair. You're getting a service here, right? So you're getting some sort of military protection from natives in the West. That doesn't seem terribly unreasonable. If you're importing sugar, you're importing a product. That doesn't seem terribly unreasonable to be taxed. Requiring that the currency not be individual paper money from all of the different colonies doesn't seem terribly unreasonable. Sure, they're not happy about it, but it doesn't cross the line of being outrageous. What becomes outrageous is the Stamp Act, okay? This is the one that really sends them over the edge. The Stamp Act requires that all paper products, whether it is a college diploma, whether it's a newspaper, a legal document of some sort, like a marriage contract or a land deal where you've got a land deed that's being printed, even playing cards. If you're going to go play poker, you better have a deck of cards with the appropriate stamp on the paper that's on the card. Otherwise, they're illegal. So this stamp, you had to pay to get the appropriate paper to write your documents on. And if it didn't have this legal stamp, this is what it looked like, right? American 1 penny. And this is the stamp that had to be in the corner of the paper for making it legitimate paper. What if I told you that any assignments that you turn into me had to be on special paper, and the only paper that I would accept was paper that I sold to you? That doesn't seem terribly fair when you can get paper anywhere. So this Stamp Act was simply about generating revenue. That gets into this distinction between internal and external taxes. This Stamp Act was simply an internal tax. It was about generating money directly from the colonists. Now, the colonists were really angry about this one. So in the newspapers, they kind of mock the Stamp Act, and they put this cartoon. This is the place to affix the stamp. So in the newspaper, here's the front page of the newspaper. Up here in the corner where it was supposed to have this special paper stamp on it, they've drawn this skull and crossbones instead. So again, if we're thinking about HAP, historical situation, intended audience, purpose, and point of view, the historical situation here is the growing conflict between the colonies and the British government. The intended audience would be the British government, right? We're not going to participate. This is the place to affix the stamp. We're not going to do it. The purpose here is protest. It's to, to protest an unfair tax, to gain some sort of action. They want this Stamp Act repealed. Okay, when they start complaining about it, the British government is saying, wait a minute, because Benjamin Franklin, he goes over to England, tries to smooth things over. Benjamin Franklin, ever the diplomat here, trying to negotiate. He goes to England and he said, look, we're upset because we don't have any representation in Parliament where the taxes are being created. If you would just allow the colonies to elect representatives to go and sit in Parliament and have a vote when these policies are created, that would resolve it all. Now let's think about this. How many colonies are there? There's only 13. If you allowed each colony even to have their own representative to go and sit in Parliament, that's still only 13 votes. The British Parliament, this would be nothing. They would have very, very little power in the Congress, in the Parliament, if they even had representation. The British were furious. Absolutely not. Instead, they began to promote the idea. They're saying, but you do already have representation. We call it virtual representation. Virtual representation meant that every member of Parliament represented the interest of every British subject everywhere in the world. So they weren't necessarily representing a single geographic area. They were representing everybody. So they're saying that all of the members of Parliament represent all of the interests of all of the colonies. How many of those people in the Parliament do you think had ever actually been to North America? Very few. Okay, so they don't understand the issues of the frontier. They don't understand the issues of colonial trade and in those cities. So this was probably not the best solution. I like to think of the what ifs. What if they had accepted Benjamin Franklin's proposal? What if they had said, oh, okay, well, maybe you're right. We'll allow 13 new representatives to come and become members of parliament. What would have happened? Would it have calmed down all of this turmoil? Would we have avoided the American Revolution? Would where we're sitting right here today, would we be part of Canada? Would we be part of the British, Great Britain today? Who knows? But I think it's interesting to think about the proposal that was made that was ignored by the British. So now we're heading into rebellion, out and out rebellion. It's been a lot of, just bitter tension that's building up, and now it's going to spill over into heated conflict. So when the colonists were rebelling against taxation, you might think, well, maybe the poor and the lower classes in England would probably be on board with this. And that's what the colonists were actually hoping for. They were hoping for support among the lower classes in England as well. And they didn't get much sympathy. If you look at this comparison, so if you look at how much tax is being paid each year, so the taxes that the people of Great Britain had been paying in a year in comparison to those that are being paid by your average citizen living in New England, there wasn't a whole lot of sympathy for those American colonists. Most people in England at the time viewed those colonists as just being given everything and not having to invest a whole lot in what's happening in society. So the Stamp Act, again, this was the policy that really, really touched off bitter anger among the colonists. So they meet together again. Now, what was the last time that we saw a convention of colonists come together? The Albany Congress, which was at the beginning in 1754, beginning of the French and Indian War. A lot of things have changed. So now we've called together another meeting of the delegates from the various states. 9 of the 13 colonies send representatives to the Stamp Act Congress. And they met in New York. So these delegates are going to meet there. New York's kind of mid-Atlantic. It's kind of the center there of the various colonies. They meet together in New York, and they put together 3 main points, all right? They are not declaring independence. So the Stamp Act Congress does not declare independence. But what it does is say that they should be protected as Englishmen, that all of their rights should be protected, and that these taxes are unfair and they're being taken advantage of, okay? And they say that in the colonies, they will only pay taxes to their own local colonial legislature. So the House of Burgesses in Virginia will tax the people of Virginia, not Parliament. So they kind of draw a line in the sand. We're not going to pay your taxes. And they were willing to boycott British goods until the Stamp Act was repealed. This whole thing is about money. So one of the leading places where England is making money is exporting finished products to the colonies. Well, the colonies say, you know what, we're just not going to buy your English goods. And if nobody in America is buying English goods, then that's going to hurt the merchants in London, who will then put pressure on Parliament to get rid of the taxes. So they're not going to fight with their military, they're going to fight economically. So these boycotts are an economic way of forcing an issue. So the Stamp Act Congress establishes the boycott. So I would be very clear here that they put in place a boycott of British goods. They're going to hurt them financially in order to force their hand to back down. In the various colonies, groups of people become very interested in the issues, and they form their own patriot groups known as the Sons of Liberty. Probably the most famous group that is part of the Sons of Liberty would be that of Boston. The Boston Sons of Liberty. They're going to be founded and led by Samuel Adams and John Hancock. They're going to be the leaders there in Boston. Notice this flyer advertising people to join in with the Sons of Liberty and to not get involved or not to pay these stamps. So we've got the true born Sons of Liberty are desired to meet under the Liberty Tree at 12 o'clock this day to hear the public resignation under oath of Andrew Oliver, Esquire, distributor of the stamps for the province of Massachusetts Bay. A resignation? Yes. All right, so the Liberty Tree becomes this symbol, right? So in the center of town, the Sons of Liberty, they have forced this guy who was supposed to be the tax collector of the stamps, they forced him to resign. Well, how did they do that? Well, they did it by force and intimidation. They're basing a lot of their ideas. So these Sons of Liberty are demanding that their freedoms be protected, and they get that from different parts of the Enlightenment. Okay, so this intellectual tradition, you've got hundreds of years of English common law that are in place. Common law meaning it's this, the policies of the not having the divine right of kings. Common law would be more about where you've got this shared constitutional role where the people are representing themselves and making the decisions for the area. The Enlightenment, we're going to talk about some of those enlightened thinkers here in just a second. John Locke being one of the main ones. And then also this Republican and Whig tradition that within England, we had already seen these individuals rise up in opposition to leaders who were tyrants. We saw that with the overthrow of the monarchy and Oliver Cromwell and the Protestants come over and they take control with Oliver Cromwell replacing the king, but then we've got the overthrow with the Glorious Revolution. So again, we've seen this tradition where governments that become abusive of their power, the people rise up in rebellion. So the patriots, the Sons of Liberty are rolling all of this together into their ideas, okay? And then this is John Dickinson. He was someone who at the time in Pennsylvania was beginning to write about some of these ideas, that he's kind of the intellectual pen to paper explanation of beliefs when the Sons of Liberty were more of the people putting it all into action, okay? I would pause this video and I would either take a picture of this chart or I would jot it down. You've got some really important individuals from the Enlightenment that are going to really direct these ideas that come together to become the foundation for the United States. John Locke in the middle is the main one that we will pattern the system here in America after. You have Thomas Hobbes. That is, okay, so if we go back and we believe that everyone lives in this state of nature, that you are free to make your own decisions in this state of nature. If everybody is in this world together, okay, Hobbes believes that that's going to be dangerous because other people are going to try to get everything that's mine. And so he believes that with people being worried about protecting themselves and their possessions, that you need to have power invested in one leader who's going to protect all of those rights. Therefore, he believes that an absolute monarchy is the best way to go, right? So he believes if we're in a state of nature and it is, it's dangerous out there, the best thing for us to do is to have an absolute monarch who will protect the needs of everybody from everybody else, because it's too dangerous. People are selfish. They're going to look out for themselves. They're not going to look out for everybody else. Now, John Locke is a little more optimistic. He believes that in the state of nature, that people are going to follow laws. They're going to have reason. They're going to understand what is right and what is wrong. And because they understand right from wrong, they're going to act appropriately, okay? So he says that people are able to make that decision for themselves, and they enter into the social contract with their government. So now we've already looked at the social contract before. That was that diagram that we saw where you've got the monarch and you've got the people, and they're in this agreement with one another, and both sides have responsibilities and both sides have rights. The people have the right to be protected by their government. People have the responsibility to follow the rules set by the government. If the government becomes abusive of those rules, then the people have the right to take power away, okay? So under this system, we would say that a Republican form of government is the best, where the people elect representatives to make decisions for them, to protect the safety of everybody, okay? Then if we've got Rousseau, he's going to be another one of the enlightened thinkers. He just believes that, oh, everybody's going to be living peacefully together and there's not going to be any sort of conflict among anybody. Very, very, very idealistic. And he believes that everyone is absolutely equal. Now, there are elements of all of this in all of these, right? So we believe here in this equality as well, but he believes that people aren't going to hurt each other naturally, where this is the extreme over here with complete fear of everybody. This is complete trust in everybody, and that's probably not the best idea. And they believe that communities need to remain small in order for this to work. So the best form of government under his philosophy would be a direct democracy, wherever, like we talked about in world history. So in a direct democracy, everybody has an equal say in every issue. So these are some of the philosophies that will feed into the Stamp Act Congress and some of the Sons of Liberty and some of those new ideas that are beginning to come about. So John Locke, they write a lot about natural rights. And we're already beginning to see people question how that equates with slavery that is well entrenched in the American colonies. Look what James Otis has to say about it. I will to my dying day oppose, with all the powers and faculties God has given me, all such instruments of slavery on the one hand, and villainy on the other, as this writ of assistance is. So he is again saying that this is wrong. We can't have both of these concepts, natural rights and enslaving another human being. They don't work together. Okay, so we're already seeing a recognition of that. If you're saying you value one thing, how can you act in another way? Okay, so over a couple of months, number of months, the Stamp Act boycott begins to work. And this political cartoon, I want you to really pay close attention to this. And I need to highlight a few areas here. Notice the title. You always want to look at the title of a cartoon. The Repeal, or the Funeral Procession of Miss America Stamp. Okay, so the Repeal or the Funeral Procession of Miss America Stamp. Again, I want you to make sure that you are looking at all of the quadrants of the political cartoon and making sure you're seeing what's going on. So if I look here in the background, I've got some ships. These are British flags on the ships, and those ships are sitting there. I don't see any sailors on board. They're tied together, so they look like they've been there for a while. I'm looking on this series of docks. Do you see any people moving around here? Nope, looks pretty empty. I come over here and I see boxes of things, stamps for America, black cloth returned from America. So we've got very little activity that's going on here in an area that we would think would normally be bustling with traffic here on a port city. Then as we move on around, we've got some official looking people here. We've got, looks like skull and crossbones where they're headed in here. This looks like it's probably a tomb of some sort. This is actually George Grenville right here. And George Grenville is carrying this little coffin. And if you were to see this close up, on top of the coffin would be the stamp. So if we're looking at the historical situation of this cartoon, we're talking about the conflict or the end of salutary neglect, where the British have tried to impose taxes on the colonies to make money to pay for the debt from the French and Indian War. As a result of the Stamp Act, right, the Stamp Act has been passed, the colonists instituted a boycott from the Stamp Act Congress. So what they've done here is they end up repealing the Stamp Act, because these merchants, just as the colonists had wanted, put pressure on the Parliament to get rid of that tax, and they take it back. So this is the repeal. Now, every year when we go through this cartoon in class, people are like, what is the dog doing? For some reason, there is a dog down here who is using the restroom. And we're going to see a lot of random dogs in these early political cartoons. So the purpose here, again, showing that the merchant class has been impacted, and that is resulting in the repeal of the Stamp Act. Okay. At the same time that they repeal the Stamp Act, King George does not want to appear weak. So King George also issues, at the very same time that the Stamp Act is repealed, the Declaratory Act is put in place. And all the Declaratory Act says is that the king and Parliament has the power to issue any law or tax anyone within the British Empire that they want. So they are declaring their power over the colonies. So it's almost like, yeah, you may have won this battle right here over the Stamp Act. Maybe it was going a little bit too far, but we are declaring that as the British government or Parliament, we can tax you whenever we want. Okay? And they do. The new prime minister comes in, who George Grenville is out. The new prime minister is Charles Townshend. He comes in, he's got this same mess, and he's going to put a tax on most items that are coming into the colonies, whether it's paint, glass, tea was part of the Townshend Act. Pretty much any imported good was subject to a tax by the Townshend Act. When we have the boycotts, the non-importation of goods is critical. So if you're not importing these finished products, let's say that you're not importing dresses or shirts or pants or whatever for the colonists to buy to clothe their families, well, then you're going to have to make your own clothes. If you're not importing cloth that's been woven, then you're going to have to weave your own. If you're not importing sugar, or you're not importing coffee, or you're not importing tea because you're boycotting, then you've got to find a substitute to support your family. Well, whose responsibility will that be within the family? It's going to be the women. So even though the Stamp Act Congress was made up only of male delegates, the women of the colonies were the ones who actually made the boycott successful. And we're going to call these women who band together, they come together in their communities, and they have these sewing bees, and they weave cloth together as a group to churn out and be more efficient. We're going to call them the Daughters of Liberty. Okay, now this is a pretty famous cartoon here. It's been used a number of times on the AP exam, that's representing the role that women played in the colonial revolutionary movement of boycotts. So women were not necessarily out during the American Revolution wielding a gun and fighting in battle, but their role was critical for the success of the revolution. Okay, so these women were being depicted here with their musket and the powder horn, which would be the gunpowder that goes in there, and the tricorn hat. And then you've got their flag back here where they're maintaining control of their communities. So this, anytime you see this cartoon, this is representing the Daughters of Liberty and their role in making the boycotts actually work. This is another famous cartoon, and I want us to think about point of view here. So this is another good cartoon, and every year when I bring this one up, I just leave it on the screen for a minute, And the kids are looking at it and they just cannot figure out what is happening in this particular cartoon. So notice the title here, A Society of Patriotic Ladies, 1775. So we're getting close to the Revolutionary War, and it's depicting the Edenton Ladies' Tea Party. So Edenton was a community where they were known for the women working together. I believe it was in North Carolina, and sewing and making sure that their community was following the boycotts very closely. So when we start to look at this cartoon, people they can't figure out what's happening. All right, so let me draw your attention to a few things. Look at these women. All right, look at her face right here. She looks to be someone who's in charge. She's not being depicted in a way that's terribly attractive. Her hair's all kind of crazy. She's holding up a gavel. You've got these women here who are writing on some sort of a document of some sort. How much participation did women have in legal affairs in the 1700s? None. You've got this man over here, and he is in close proximity to this woman, maybe looking like they're behaving in a way that's not appropriate for public. You've got people who are drinking out of the dishes. You've got people over there who are pouring things out into hats that doesn't look very seemly. Look at the child over here that's kind of on its own, and it's spilling this food on the floor. Are any of these ladies paying attention to the child? Nope. And then here's another dog that's now using the restroom on this woman's leg and biting the child. So what is the purpose? What is the message that they're trying to get across in this cartoon? You've got an enslaved woman back here who is participating as well. If this is talking about the Carolinas, most likely this woman would not have been a free African living in the colonies. Most likely she would have been an enslaved woman interacting with these white women. So you've got women portrayed in a very manly way, shirking their responsibilities to take care of the children and keep a happy, clean home, behaving in a way that's a little flirtatious in public, getting involved in business, smuggling some items here. This is not behavior that would have been acceptable for women. So if I'm picking up on these ideas and we think about point of view, from whose point of view would this cartoon be drawn? Would this be the colonies talking about the women's participation in the non-importation movement? Or would this be the British view of what colonial women are doing? This is going to be the British view. So this is a British cartoon representing all of the problems that they see with women behaving in this way in the colonies, that they are not acting in a way that's feminine, that they are getting involved in the role of the men with the political ideas, and that this is just out of control, that women should not be behaving this way. So again, historical situation, audience, purpose, and point of view. This cartoon would lend itself really well to point of view because this is depicting the point of view of the British towards the American women engaged in the boycotts. The historical situation would certainly be the Stamp Act Congress and the boycotts that resulted from that the women were participating in. In addition to all of these issues, we've got problems in the West. In Western migration, we have land speculators. Now that this is all the territory of Great Britain, the land speculators, that Ohio company that we talked about before, they want to grab up that land. You've got people who were Indian traders who wanted to go out there where the French had cornered the market on the fur trade. Now you've got British colonial colonists who want to go out there and trade with the natives. You've also just plain got poor people in the East who haven't had much opportunity, who want to move into this new Western territory to have more land for themselves to try to make more of an opportunity. All of these groups are migrating to the west, and it's adding to the conflict with the natives. Now, the British had tried to stop this by putting in place that Proclamation of 1763. They're recognizing that that's not going to be enough. And so to respond, the British are going to be bringing in more soldiers. But look what happens. So 1763, this is when the French and Indian War was being fought. So it made sense that we had all of these British soldiers, right? So the larger the circle, the larger the concentration of British soldiers are out here in the West. The war is now over, but look what happens to the distribution of soldiers. How many native groups are we fighting against right here in and around Boston? Probably not very many. This is what upsets the colonists, that if the problem is that they need to have more soldiers in the colonies in order to protect from native advancements or the American Indians in the region, then those soldiers need to be positioned out here in the West, not concentrated in and around an urban port city in Boston. So this is really adding to the irritation that the colonists are experiencing. The importation, okay, so this is the amount of imports that the colonists are getting from Great Britain, and the green line would be how much they are exporting to Great Britain. All right, so the non-importation agreements, here's the Stamp Act put in place. Colonists quit bringing in British goods, and so it declines pretty dramatically. They repeal the Stamp Act, it goes back up again. But then we're going to see that there's more trouble with the Townshend Acts. We're going to see a more concentrated effort to coordinate the boycotts, and the importation goes down dramatically. They begin imports once again, but then by the 1700s or 1770s, we're going to see a dramatic decline with the non-importation agreements, and then all trade is cut off when the American Revolution begins, and the series of events that occur in 1774, 75, and 76, which is what we're going to concentrate on next. Okay. This is another political cartoon that you absolutely need to be familiar with, and it is depicting an incident that occurs in Boston. So we've talked about the increase in the number of British soldiers in and around Boston, and it erupts into what the colonists refer to as the Bloody Massacre. This building back here, okay, this building back here is called the Customs House. If you've ever flown internationally and you've gone somewhere out of the United States, and when you come back in, you have to go through customs, which means that you have to tell them all of the items that you're bringing in from the other country, and then they can assess whether or not it's got to be taxed and that kind of thing. When a ship would sail into the port at Boston, tax collectors from the customs house would go on board the ship, assess the amount of cargo that was there, assess the amount of tax that was owed, and all of that business would be conducted here at the customs house in the port. So if this is all about taxing the cargo of the imported goods, this is probably a building that has a lot of control by the British government, not so much the colonial government, okay? The colonists are getting a little bit more frustrated by the presence of the British soldiers within their community. And they begin to taunt them, and they resent that they're there. And one night, it was in March, and of 1773, I believe it was. Is it 3? It's either 3 or 4. Hang on. 1770. So one night there was a soldier who had been patrolling out here in front of the customs house, because again, the Sons of Liberty are in action now, and they're using a lot of violence and intimidation against tax collectors. They're tar and feathering them. They're throwing rocks at their homes and really scaring them into not enforcing the taxes. So the Customs House might have been a prime target for the Sons of Liberty, and the British had posted a soldier there all night long to make sure that the building was safe. Well, one night in March, these boys, teenage boys, were roaming around in front of the Customs House, and they began to call the soldier names, terrible names like Lobsterback, right? Because he's wearing that bright red coat. And they start throwing snowballs, and the guy's a little concerned, and so he sounds this alarm, and some more soldiers show up. And in total, there's going to end up being 9 soldiers here in front of the Customs House, and they form a line. And the boys are throwing these snowballs, and the crowd's kind of gathering when the rest of the soldiers show up. And all of a sudden, a shot rings out. And the colonists had been daring them, right? Go ahead, fire on us, we dare you to fire on us, or something like that. And all of a sudden, one of them did. And when it was all over with, because the musket fire, right, it's a lot of smoke comes out, there were 5 colonists who had been killed. And this depiction, so now think about what's happened. You've got British soldiers who have now shot and killed British citizens in a British colony. So this is a terrible situation for the British. The colonists are going to depict this as a massacre. So this political cartoon, this was actually created by Paul Revere. I would make note of that. Paul Revere was a silversmith. He's also going to be involved in the battle at Lexington and Concord. But anyway, he makes this engraving, and you engrave it, and then you put ink on it, and then you stamp the paper on it. And this is printed across all of the colonies. Because if this can happen in Boston, could it happen in Charleston? Could it happen in Philadelphia? Could it happen in New York? Can it happen anywhere in the colonies? And the answer is yes. And so it really propels the colonists to become more aggressive in their actions against the British. So again, everybody says, look, there's another dog down there. And there is. But I want us to look at how Paul Revere has portrayed everybody. Do any of these people look like they are the aggressor in the situation? No, they're shrinking back. They're laying on the ground. They look scared. But then if we look at these soldiers, who would this guy be? He would be the commander, wouldn't he? So notice where Paul Revere has positioned him, behind the soldiers. And then they look like they're stepping forward. They're the aggressor. They are completely at fault in all of this. These soldiers are going to be arrested, and the colonists want them to be put to death for murdering colonial citizens of Boston. And it ends up being this spectacle of a trial. And it ends up that John Adams is going to be the lawyer who ends up representing the soldiers. And I've got a film clip that I normally show of the John Adams miniseries of the trial and of the Boston Massacre. And I may show that on one of the Wednesdays coming up, the review time periods, because I think this is a good clip for you to see. Or I may just give you the name of it, and you can find it and watch it on your own if you want to. But bottom line, the question is, why would John Adams do that? We think of John Adams as being such a patriot. Well, he was. He said that if these British soldiers did not get a fair trial in the colonies, were the colonies any better than Great Britain? And the answer is no. And so he takes a very bold stand on the law and legal representation for everybody, even though it wasn't the popular thing to do. His cousin, Samuel Adams, was furious with him and said that he wasn't a good Boston citizen. But in the end, it turns out that this soldier right here was standing in front of his men. There's no way that he would have given the command for them to fire on this crowd if he were standing in front of them. So it ends up that the trial in Massachusetts, and this was a Massachusetts trial with a jury made up of men from Boston, they ended up acquitting all of the soldiers and found them innocent because the testimony didn't line up. So in the end, John Adams looks really good coming out of this trial because he had stood up for what was right and what was legal and what was fair, but he paid a high personal price for that in the months leading up to the trial. Okay. So this is also from the newspapers. There were 5 who were killed, 4 immediately, and then the 5th one died later in the afternoon. This is representing those individuals who had died in the Boston Massacre, and CA here is representing Crispus Attucks, and he was a free black man living in Boston at the time, and people refer to him often when they are looking at the Boston Massacre because he was part of this. He was a free man who was also frustrated with the British government at the time. So here is the Customs House today. Now, I've told you that my friends and I, my history teacher friends and I, we love to travel and go to historic places. And this is the Customs House. And look, Paul Revere did a pretty good job. Here is his depiction of the Customs House. You can see the window and the door up here and the roof of it. And here it is today. So it's exactly as Paul Revere had depicted it. But it's right in the middle of downtown Boston. And you've got all of these big modern skyscrapers surrounding it. And it's kind of interesting when you go to these cities and see how the old part of the city and the new part of the city have kind of meshed together. So my friends and I, when we were there, they've got in the middle of the road this big medallion that's commemorating the spot that the Boston Massacre took place. So when the traffic light turned red, my friends and I, we had all planned this out, and we laid down in the road, and another person took the photograph of us recreating the Boston Massacre. So there we are. There's 5 of us laying on this medallion, and it's got March the 3rd, 1770. So there we are in Boston, and then these other people are like, what are they doing? But we got up before the light turned green again. Okay, so after the Boston Massacre, you can imagine that the British government was really in a bind here because you've got these colonists who were already protesting and already inflicting violence and destruction on buildings, public buildings within these urban areas. And so they've got to do something to try to calm things down. So one of the things that Parliament does is they say, okay, no more Townshend Acts. We take those back. But similarly to where they repealed the Stamp Act, didn't they repeal the Stamp Act, but then issue the Declaratory Act that says, but we can still tax you if we want to? That's exactly what they do here with the Townshend Act. They repeal the Townshend Acts, that's the tax on all kinds of imported products, but they leave in place the tax on tea. Why? Because they can. Okay, so we've got the repeal here, but we still have this emphasis that yes, Parliament is still in charge. Yes, colonies, you are still under our control. And they leave the tax on tea, and that really, really upsets the colonists. So if we go back to our Benjamin Franklin Albany Plan for Union at the Albany Congress in 1754, we said at that time that he was kind of a forward thinker. He was someone who was looking ahead at the possibilities for uniting and working together as a group of colonies rather than staying independent. And at that time, nobody was willing to do it because things had not gotten bad enough. Are things bad enough yet? We're getting close. So this is the direct path here that will lead us into war. We've already talked about the Sons of Liberty. One of the other organizations that will form across the various communities in and around Massachusetts and then into the other colonies will be what are known as committees of correspondence. And in Massachusetts, there were 80-something different communities that had people designated to pass the word to somebody else. It's almost like this, an old-time phone tree where if something happens, I'm supposed to contact and call this person, and that person's supposed to call somebody else. We know who is supposed to contact who so that the information is spread very quickly. Well, Samuel Adams came up with that idea. And again, he was the cousin of John Adams, and he was a merchant, local merchant in Boston. And he was very committed to the Patriot cause and the Sons of Liberty. And this, he believed, was the most efficient way to distribute information when it became necessary. One of the other caveats to the Tea Act being protected when the Townshend Act was repealed is the fact that this East India Company, which was given a royal charter by the king, was in financial trouble. They had a surplus of tea because with the boycotts that had been in place, the colonies weren't importing enough tea. And when you've got a surplus of something, the price goes down, and the East India Company was about to go bankrupt. But this was a royally, this company had a royal charter. They were like the preferred vendor of the king. So the king implements a new Tea Act that says the colonies have to buy East India Company tea and not the tea that they had been smuggling in from the Netherlands, the Dutch tea that was really cheap for them to get. And you had merchants who were making money because they were smuggling it in. Well, the colonies were furious because they felt that they were being manipulated into protecting this royal company that had been given a monopoly. They couldn't get a variety of tea or competition that keeps the prices down for everybody. East India Company was the protected company that had to sell tea. Colonists were very, very angry. Well, the king was determined that the colonists were going to be purchasing this tea, sends the East India Company ships over. In the ports at Philadelphia, New York, and Charleston, the colonists turned them away, said, "We don't want your tea here, it's no good." Well, in Boston, the Boston Port Authority at that time was controlled by the king, was determined to bring the tea in. And so the ships will arrive. There are 3 ships of tea that come into Boston, and the Sons of Liberty have had enough. They go to the local tavern, they plot and they plan. And one night in December, I believe it was, they go into the harbor. Okay, it was, yes, December 1773. They dress up like Mohawk Indians, disguising themselves. They go aboard the ship and they begin to dump the chest of tea into the harbor. 300 and something chests of tea. And if you look at the value of that tea today, it's close to $1 million worth of tea that they dump into the harbor. So now they've destroyed all this property. That's really the property of the king because the East India Company had a royal charter. I had always envisioned, when I think of the Boston Tea Party and dumping the chest of tea, I think about instant tea, you know, that's granular and you've got it in a jar or something and you put it into your glass and you stir it up. Okay, I had always envisioned that granular tea as to what was being dumped in the harbor. And that's actually not the case. Look at this picture. This is a block of tea, and this was how they would ship the tea at the time. And it was scored, right, almost like perforation here. And when you were making tea or brewing tea, you would pinch off a corner and you would put it into your boiling water and it would dissolve. And then you would pinch off the next corner. And these little designs on each side would be representative of the company that is selling the tea. So it's like their trademark. And I didn't know that. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And it's the granular tea leaves that you're familiar with, but it's compressed into these blocks that are semi-solid. But when you put it into water, it dissolves. All right, so that's what would be filling the chest that they dump into the harbor. This is another very famous political cartoon that is looking at the Boston Tea Party. So here you've got the Sons of Liberty dumping the tea in the harbor. You've got the tax collector that's been tarred and feathered. They're forcing the tea down his throat, and they're underneath the Liberty Tree. And this sign says Stamp Act, but it's upside down, representing the fact that they have undone the Stamp Act. And so you've got these Sons of Liberty that are just wreaking havoc all across Boston. And the British government's going to try to get control. When they destroy that incredibly expensive tea, $1 million worth of tea, just dumped into the harbor. The British government's going to punish Boston, and they punish them through a series of laws known as the Coercive Acts. Coerce somebody means that you force them to do something. And this was punishment that was inflicted on Boston until the value of the tea was paid back. Well, you can imagine the Sons of Liberty were like, yeah, we're not paying that back. You can forget it. So these intolerable acts are separate policies, but together we call them the Coercive Acts. In the colonies, they called them the Intolerable Acts because they said that this was going way too far. First of all, they're going to close the port at Boston. It's going to be shut down. What is the way that everybody pretty much in Boston is able to make a living? It's through the shipping industry. Either you're a rope maker, or you're a sailor, or you're a merchant that's doing the trading, or in some way your job is tied to the trade that goes in and out of the port. So the British government is going to shut it down. They're going to put a blockade in front of the Boston harbor, and no ships are going to come in or out until the value of the tea is paid back. So now people who, let's say that you were not part of the Sons of Liberty and you just wanted to make money and live your own life and stay out of it. Now all of these issues are impacting you. So these intolerable acts begin to draw more and more people into the cause. Number two, the Massachusetts Government Act. The British government is going to disband the town meetings and the local assemblies of the Massachusetts colony. No longer are they going to be allowed to have their own local government. They shut it down. The royal governor is the only person making policy and decisions within the colony of Massachusetts. The Administration of Justice Act, instead of people accused of crimes who may be tax collectors or government officials being tried in a Massachusetts court, they will be tried in a British court. So again, you're taking power, local power, away from the colony. The Quartering Act, they're going to ramp up the numbers of soldiers who come into Boston. Now, we previously had a Quartering Act that said that the colonies were responsible for the financial support for the soldiers who are there. This Quartering Act says that if there aren't enough barracks for all the soldiers who are coming to Boston to get order, then you may have to put them up in your own barn or in your own home. That's going to be an issue as well. And then the Quebec Act was kind of an add-on to the original Coercive Acts. The Quebec Act, if you'll remember, Quebec was in New France, that's now part of Great Britain, so in Canada. And the property of Quebec is expanded dramatically, and the British are going to allow them to worship as Catholics if they wanted to. Well, this was horrifying to those, the holdovers of the old Massachusetts Puritan ideology to allow Catholicism in British colonies. So these policies of the Coercive Acts were widely distributed, and everyone in all of the colonies knew about them. And people were devastated. They were highly upset that this could happen in Boston or it could happen in any of their colonies. So a new meeting of delegates from the colonies come together. This time we've got 12 of the colonies. Before, I believe there were 9 of the colonies that send delegates when they went to the Stamp Act Congress. Now you've got 12. The only one still not joining is Georgia, and it's because, again, they're relatively new. The Continental Congress this time is going to meet in Philadelphia, and they're going to look at the issues here in and around Boston and how to handle it. So I go back to the question, Albany Congress, Albany Plan of Union, are things bad enough? Are they ready to declare independence from England? No, but they're getting really, really close. Here's what they end up deciding. They're going to, number one, demand that the Coercive Acts be taken off the board. And number two, they're going to implement another boycott, and it's going to be even more coordinated among all of these colonies. These continental associations are going to make sure that every colony is enforcing the boycott. And notice that they're adding on to this. Not only are they boycotting goods coming in from England, they're now going to stop exporting to England. So they're thinking that that's going to hurt England as well. Now that was risky because it could also hurt themselves, but they were banking on trade with the French or the Spanish. All right, so they are not willing to declare independence yet, but what we do have are new boycotts, and we have new actions that connect the colonies together through the continental associations, which enforce the boycotts. They make sure if there are merchants in town that are selling British goods, they shut them down. If there are people who are not abiding by those policies or working together, they shut them down. So the First Continental Congress is going to be a more coordinated effort. Okay, so then this is another important cartoon. So you've got Boston cannonaded, meaning that they're being shot upon. You've got the able doctor or America swallowing the bitter drought. And so it's the T. And so this is supposedly Miss America over here who is being, and then Lady Liberty is watching this. And you know, it's just a terrible scene where the British are violating Americans, okay? So how many people in the colonies were actually patriots? And it's not the majority, okay? If we look at the breakdown, this is showing 20% loyalists, 40% patriots, 40% neutral. A lot of people just wanted it to go away. They just wanted to live their lives. They did not want to get involved in such a controversial issue. That was hard to do. And these numbers change over the course of the revolutionary period. So this would have been early on where you had about 40% that would have been neutral. Many of those people who were in the neutral category are going to shift themselves over to the patriot side as things go on and as issues erupt beyond just Massachusetts. Okay, so a loyalist is someone who lived in the colony who remained loyal to the king. Now, let's look at this breakdown. So ignore the colors on this chart. Look at the key here. The loyalists, where they were located primarily, would be in blue. Charleston, Savannah, Norfolk, Philadelphia, New York, Newport. Not Boston because of all the drama that's taken place there. Why would these locations have more people who are loyalists than others? Probably because they're merchants. So if you've got boycotts on exports and imports, who's being hurt the most? The merchants who are doing the importing and the exporting who live in the port towns. These are the major ports in the American colonies at the time. So that's where you would have found most of the loyalists going into the American Revolution. The contested areas where they're trying to get people on each side would be in this backcountry region. And then the patriots, we're going to see them on the outskirts of town, and then certainly here in New England because of what has happened with the Boston Massacre and the Coercive Acts after the Boston Tea Party. Now, please, 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 please emphasize in your notes, the Coercive Acts were a response to the Boston Tea Party. It was not a response to the Boston Massacre. The Boston Massacre happened 3 years prior to the Boston Tea Party. These are separate events, same location, separate events. So make sure that you don't get confused on that. There are also a couple of different names that you may encounter. The Patriots sometimes are referred to as Whigs. Same idea. It's kind of like these radicals who want more independence and freedom. And then you've got the Loyalists who remained loyal to the king. They sometimes were referred to as the Tories. So it's the same group of people, multiple different names. All right, so here we are back again. We've got Benjamin Franklin. We've got the Albany Plan for Union back at the Albany Congress in 1754. And the colonists said, no, 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 we've got to remain independent. We're independent colonies. We don't want to work with any other colonies. Well, guess what? We will finally get to the point today where it is time for them to work together as a unit. Okay. In this western region, the Indians had risen up again in an alliance. Okay, so you've got the alliance here of the natives in the west, and the opportunities for investors is in danger. And the people who've moved out here into the frontier are in danger. And you now have 2 colonies that are claiming this territory for themselves. So all of this that's in the dotted line is claimed by Virginia, but it's also claimed by Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania has actually done a pretty good job of dividing up the land and setting up these political foundations for it being added into Pennsylvania. What they don't have is a militia that's out there to protect from any other involvement from other colonies. The royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore at the time, is going to send out a militia group to claim all of this territory for Virginia. So once again, this is kind of a repeat of what we saw with Governor Dinwiddie and George Washington that goes out to the very same area. This is all still the Ohio River Valley, right? There's the Ohio River. It's all in this same general area to try to get control. Well, when they do and they force the Indians out, this was just, it was like Lord Dunmore was the hero of these poor Virginians who were living in the back country, because now they had land that was protected for themselves. So they claim all of this and it becomes part of Virginia. Pennsylvania is not very happy about that, by the way. Okay. And then the people in Boston are now going, again, they're being occupied by the British soldiers because of the Coercive Acts and the Intolerable Acts. And there are rumors spreading that with these committees of correspondence in place and the networks that are involved, that people on the outskirts of town are stockpiling weapons and ammunition, and they are plotting to get rid of the British soldiers from Boston. And the military commander, Thomas Gage, is going to send the British soldiers out on a mission. And they've got 2 objectives, all right? So Thomas Gage, here's Boston. Notice that Boston is like this peninsula that sits here in the harbor. And he's going to send his soldiers out on a mission to capture the leaders of the Sons of Liberty. They've gotten information. Remember, there's loyalists that are still kind of scattered in and among the people here in Massachusetts. The loyalists have indicated that Sam Adams and John Hancock are hiding out in the little town of Lexington, which would be over here, and that's where they're hiding out, and that they are plotting and they're growing the Sons of Liberty. And there's also been rumor that over here in Concord, that there are stockpiles of weapons on this farm that's across the Old North Bridge, across the Concord River, and that it is being stored there. So Thomas Gage sends out 700 soldiers on this mission to arrest and make an example of John Hancock and Sam Adams in Lexington, and to seize the weapons and the ammunition that are being stored by the Patriots. Well, just like there are loyalists who are spreading rumors, there's also patriots who are catching wind to what the plan is of Thomas Gage. And that sets in motion the committees of correspondence. So you've heard the story of Paul Revere's midnight ride, where he goes and he warns everybody that the British are on the way. Here is the British route. Okay, so they leave Boston and they are headed down the road to Lexington. Paul Revere is going to go on this route from the Old North Church. So again, you know, they've got the signal in the Old North Church. They're going to put the lantern in there, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. So he puts the lantern there saying they're headed our way. And he goes and he begins to alert all of these little towns. So they get to Mystic or Medford, and they're going to notify other communities. You've got Robert Dawes, who's going to come, or William Dawes, who's going to come in this other direction and notify other communities along the way. And there was actually a third one who's not depicted on this route that comes out of Boston. But in any event, by the time the British soldiers get to Boston, because they're marching down the main road, they're in their bright red coats, they're in the perfect little lines, they've got their little drums, and they're headed down the road. And when they get to Lexington, the men of Lexington are standing on the Lexington Green, which is like the town square, and they are waiting on the British soldiers. And it's kind of the standoff. And the British commander tells the men to disperse, and they say, we're not going to disperse. And then fighting erupts, and sometimes you'll hear this referred to as the shot heard round the world, because the fighting at Lexington Green is really the start of the American Revolution, where things have gotten bad enough and they are going to declare independence, and this launches that into motion. So this is in April of 1775. So think about where we are. We're a year out from the Declaration of Independence, but this sets everything into motion. Now, the committees of correspondence, they had gotten word to Lexington before the British soldiers arrived that the British were on the way. So Sam Adams and John Hancock escaped. So mission number one was not accomplished. Then they head to Concord, all right? And so again, they've got all of these networks that are launched into motion. British soldiers are marching down the road. They get to Concord. They come outside of town, they cross over the Old North Bridge, and then what do you know? Up from behind this knoll pops all of these colonists, and they're spread out, and it's like this gentle sloping hill. So the British really can't see what's behind it, and they don't know how many colonists there are. And they're spread out to where it looks like the British are completely surrounded. And there's a little bit of fighting there. Bottom line, the British, they have to evacuate and retreat. So now they've got to head all the way back to Boston. But in the meantime, all of these little communities outside of town have launched their Minutemen into motion. The Minutemen, they're ready to fight at a minute's notice. And they're hiding out behind trees and rocks all along this road that goes back to Boston. And they just pick off one soldier at a time with sniper type attacks. And when it was all over with, there were, on the British side, there were 73 soldiers who were killed, 174 wounded, and 26 missing. So we're talking about a third of the British force is decimated. Colonists, not nearly as many. They've lost 49 and 39 wounded. Okay, when my friends and I went to Boston, we took a fabulous trip. And this looks like it's a long way. It's really not. This is, you know, maybe from Boston to Lexington is probably like from Marietta to downtown Atlanta. It's not that far. And then between these two communities, it's maybe 4 or 5 miles. So we went to Lexington and Concord, and we took a bicycle tour. And today the Battle Road, it's not a highway, it's like a bike path, sort of like Silver Comet Trail, but it's following this historic pathway. So we took a bike ride, and we went to Concord first. We went to Old North Bridge and saw the battle at Concord. And then we got on our bicycles and we rode our bicycles just like the British did back to Lexington. And it was fascinating. All right, so here we are at the Old North Bridge, and I was expecting, oh, it's the Old North Bridge. It's got to be this, you know, really impressive structure. Are you ready for this? Here's the Old North Bridge. There's the river. Obviously, it's a replica. They've rebuilt it, but this is where they cross. It's not a huge river. It's not this massive rush. It's not like the Chattahoochee River. It's not like the Mississippi River by any means. It's just almost, in my mind, like a little creek that they cross over. But you go across on the other side, and there's this monument to the soldiers who were there. And then that's when it all began to make sense to me, because once you cross over here, all of this on this side that goes all the way around is like this little hill, and you can kind of see it here. So now I'm standing at the statue, and here's the hill, and the soldiers, the patriots, the Minutemen were all lined up all the way around here, and the British were surrounded. So they had no choice but to retreat. back across the Old North Bridge and to go back. So then we got on our bikes and we're headed back to Lexington, and we're on the Battle Road. And so this is what the path looks like today. It was a beautiful day. We were there. We went over spring break one year. And we're riding our bikes, and I was talking to one of my friends who teaches over at Harrison High School, and I said, I just don't get it. I mean, look at this. It's wide open. I don't understand how these Minutemen could just come up and pick off that many British soldiers along the way. This just does not add up. But as we got a little bit further, the terrain started to change, okay? And then, so the bike path is down here. So then what started to happen was you had these big rock formations that are right next to the pathway, and the Patriots would hide behind these rocks and they would just pop up and as snipers. And that's when they were able to take out some of those British soldiers as they were headed back to Boston. My favorite part of this, so there's the Battle Road, April 1775. In Concord, it is this cute little town, and the Colonial Inn is the oldest operating hotel in America, and it became a hotel in 1716. And when you go, we ate dinner there. We didn't stay there, but we ate dinner there. And they've got pictures of all these dignitaries from around the world who have stayed at the Concord Inn. So it's a very cute little place. And then I also was fascinated when we were in the little town, they still have that town meeting structure. Think about what we talked about as a unique feature of the New England colonies when we were studying colonies in the last unit. We said that they had town meetings where all of the male citizens were able to go and they voted on all the policies for the local decision making. They still have that structure, and they were advertising for their town meeting while we were there. So it's going to be the week of April the 23rd through May the 1st. And everybody in town was going to be going to that town meeting, and they were going to be voting on decisions like local ordinances or policies, what they would allow there. Thought that was pretty interesting. All right, so after Lexington and Concord, we also have another bit of drama that breaks out in Boston, and that's the Battle of Bunker Hill. And so we talked about Boston being this peninsula here in the harbor. And this overlooks, this is actually high ground that overlooks the city of Boston. And the colonists had fortified the top of this hill without the British recognizing that that was in the works. And the British were highly, highly concerned. So they had been embarrassed. Thomas Gage had certainly been embarrassed by what had gone on at Lexington and Concord. And he wanted to prove a point that the British Army was indeed one of the finest armies in the world. So Gage sets up this attack on Bunker Hill. So Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill are actually right next to each other. And the attack took place right here on this side of the harbor. And he lines up his men in these perfect lines, and they go straight uphill at the colonists who have fortified the top. So if you've ever played King of the Mountain or King of the Hill, you know that if you've got the high ground, you have the advantage. There is no way that these people are going to be able to overtake the people at the top if the people at the top are fortified. So they mow them down, and the British soldiers, they retreat back to the bottom. And the commander was furious, and he lines them back up again, and he says, I told you to take that hill. So they march back up the hill, and same thing happens. The colonists just wipe out this next line of soldiers, so they retreat back to the bottom. So he sends them up a third time. They're going up the hill the third time, and at that point, the colonists, they ran out of ammunition, and there was no hope in being able to maintain control of this. So the colonists ultimately had to retreat, and the British gained control of Bunker Hill. So when we talk about the Battle of Bunker Hill, it was technically a victory for the British, but it indicated, as did Lexington and Concord, that the colonists could fight against this superior military. They might not be able to use conventional warfare, you know, the hiding behind the trees and the rocks. That was sort of what the French did when George Washington went out to Fort Duquesne. Well, now he's employing those same tactics against the British. So Continental Congress meets again, May of 1775. Are we ready to declare independence yet? Not yet. They're going to try one last effort. There is, a holdout, a group of people who weren't willing to go to war just yet. They're going to send what's called the Olive Branch Petition to the king. And this was July 1775. So this is after Bunker Hill. This is after Lexington and Concord had happened in April. And they are believing at this time, Parliament is the problem. Parliament is the group of people who have imposed the intolerable acts and the unfair taxes and the Stamp Act and everything else. And they believe that the king is an ally of theirs. And they write this letter to the king, begging him to get his parliament under control. And they start out, oh, you wonderful king, blah, 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 blah. We are your most loyal subjects, blah, 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 blah. Trying to smooth things over. I mean, now you've got colonists who've killed British soldiers, so that could be bad for them as well. So they're all trying to kind of maneuver and negotiate on each side. And the Olive Branch Petition is like an offering of peace. They send that to the king, and they are asking for him to get the parliament under control. The king is furious. He rejects the Olive Branch Petition. He says that the colonies are in rebellion, and he sends even more soldiers over to the colonies. So things are not going well at all, okay? Pretty much any British representative, any representative of the British government was now hated within the colonies. So where Lord Dunmore, if we go back to Lord Dunmore's war, earlier in the 1760s, he had, that was actually in 1772, he had become a hero of these people in the back country. But now things have changed. After you've got all of this fighting, actual military action that has taken place, Lord Dunmore is one of the British government leaders in the colonies. So in Virginia, he's worried about how he is going to be protected, how his property is going to be protected, and everything else. So he issues what's called Lord Dunmore's Proclamation in 1775. And this proclamation said or offers freedom to enslaved persons or indentured servants who are willing to come and fight with the British Army. So as we've got more people who are gravitating towards that patriot cause, the British are getting a little desperate, and they're trying to lure more individuals into the British side. Dunmore's proclamation is part of that. So another type of question that College Board's going to give you, we've talked about comparison. Another one is cause and effect. So if we've got an event or a document or a policy such as Lord Dunmore's proclamation, we want to think about what caused this to happen, whether it's an event or, in this case, what caused Lord Dunmore to issue this policy granting freedom to enslaved persons and indentured servants willing to fight for the British. Okay, so the causes would be the opposition that the colonists had for Great Britain that's played out in military action at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill. And we've got the Virginia Patriots who are trying to force the royal governor out of Virginia. So he's trying to preserve his own job or his own title, his own position within Virginia and get things back to the way they were, where he was in charge. So he issues this proclamation. Okay, here are some of the long-term effects. One, the idea of emancipation comes up. Okay, not so much in the colonies, but the discussion starts to take hold in England. So ideas of emancipation. How does enslaving another human being fit with enlightened ideas of natural rights? It doesn't. So that discussion becomes more common okay, in Europe, and then also among some groups in the colonies. Here's the other impact that it has. If we went back and we looked at the areas that were loyal to the king, it was a lot of those port cities, and some of the major ports were in the South. Many of those Southern whites who had been loyal were also large owners of plantations that relied on enslaved labor. Lord Dunmore's proclamation is interfering with their enterprises or their businesses, and therefore some of those people who had previously been loyalists in the South are now going to shift to the Patriot side. Now, this doesn't happen so much in the North because you don't have as large of an enslaved population in the North. So those are going to be some of the long-term effects, really key issues that are going to be important. Also in the West, we're going to see people in the frontier, Daniel Boone and some of the others, who are asking Virginia to annex them. They want to become part of Virginia. And as they are trying to maintain control and order in these areas, that's when Virginia does indeed annex all of this area in the West, and what today we would call Kentucky become counties in the Virginia, in West Virginia. So this, if we were to carve this out today, this right here would be the state of West Virginia, and then this would be the western part of Kentucky. So all of this is now brought into the state of Virginia, or the colony of Virginia, and Daniel Boone is leading the way. So when he sends, and he goes out here with settlers, they create communities called Boonesville or Boonesboro, and they have another community called Lexington. Guess why Lexington, Kentucky, where the University of Kentucky is, guess why it's called Lexington? Because this was founded in 1775, early 1776, right after the battles at Lexington and Concord. So they're honoring the men, the Minutemen at Lexington, for what they had done against the British. This is what changes people's minds. Okay, so we've got a larger number of patriots, but we've also got people who have been blaming Parliament. And Thomas Paine is this newly immigrated American. He's come to the colonies only in like 1774 from England. He really hadn't had a very successful career at pretty much anything he's done in England up until he comes to America. But he's a really gifted writer, and he has a way of making people understand ideas and take note of those ideas in a way that makes sense. Because again, people don't have higher, degrees in education. Most people in America didn't read, or if they did, they didn't read at a very high level. Thomas Paine could explain some of these really complicated ideas of the Enlightenment in a way that everyone understands. We use the word vernacular. Vernacular represents, or it's a term that means using language that is commonly understood. And Thomas Paine was a master of that. And we're going to look at some of the excerpts from Common Sense in class. But this is a short little pamphlet that Thomas Paine wrote where he's explaining to the colonists, you have this all backwards. It is not Parliament that is to blame. It is the king who is at fault here for all of your problems. And he goes on and he talks about it just doesn't make sense for America to be a set of colonies to this little bitty tiny island of England. England has no resources. America has unlimited resources. We should be in control. And one of the examples that he gives, he talks about why should a child remain a child forever? So he's trying to equate the relationship between the colonies and England as mother country and child. And he's saying, we've matured, we've grown up, we've gone through the teenage years, we've made our mistakes. Now we're ready to be on our own and prosper and become successful. We don't need England anymore. We don't need that parent anymore. So he makes those arguments in Common Sense, and it instantly becomes a bestseller. Hundreds of thousands of people buy Thomas Paine's book, Common Sense, and they read it. and they take notice of it. And now people are really geared up. They're like, yeah, it's time. We need to be independent. The Continental Congress will meet again in 1776, and this is when the Declaration of Independence is finally drawn up. Here you see in the picture, there are 5 individuals. This is called the Committee of 5. I want you to write it down. Your book doesn't talk about it, but the Committee of 5 were given the task of formally notifying England of what they were planning to do. They're going to vote on it in July of 1776 to adopt this Declaration of Independence. So in the Committee of 5, there's Benjamin Franklin, there's Thomas Jefferson, who is the primary author. Jefferson was from Virginia. You've got Benjamin Franklin from Pennsylvania. You had Robert Livingston, who was, I believe he was from New York. Is Livingston, New York? Yes, Robert Livingston was from New York. John Adams over here was from Massachusetts. And then you had Roger Sherman, who was from Connecticut. So you have 2 New Englanders, 2 people from the middle colonies, and then you have this person from Virginia, the largest colony in the South and the one with the most power, who were given this task of writing this document. None of them thought that the Declaration of Independence was really going to become as famous as it became. So they kind of pushed the work off on Thomas Jefferson. He was not very well known at the time. He was pretty young compared to some of these others. Benjamin Franklin was absolutely the primary statesman of the Continental Congress. And John Adams was also another one of those giants at the Continental Congress. And they were like, let's let him do all the writing. Well, little did they know that the Declaration of Independence becomes this very critical foundational document that other countries around the world will emulate and try to follow. We're going to read the Declaration of Independence in class as well, but I want to show you where this was all completed. Here is Independence Hall, and so they've got this lovely park that's in front of Independence Hall today, and the Liberty Bell is out in this building over here to the right. I'm standing on the steps of a building that's known as the Constitution Center. We'll talk more about that in the next chapter. But it's a great museum to the Constitution and its writing, and it looks directly across the way to Independence Hall, where the Declaration of Independence was signed. So in the room, you had the delegates who were seated by colonies. So they sat together as a group of colonies, and then it was presided over. John Hancock was the president of the Continental Congress at that time. And so then they made the decision. They voted on it. They had to make some edits and additions and everything to Thomas Jefferson's version, but eventually they did vote to secure it. John Adams, when he wrote in his diary about that day, he talked about how it would be, he actually talked about July the 2nd, because that was the day that they actually voted on declaring independence, but they didn't sign the document till the 4th. But anyway, he talks about how this would be a day that would be remembered with fireworks and great celebrations and everything else. He was right. July the 4th is the day that we celebrate independence in the United States. But you also need to consider the words, okay? When they talk about in the opening, and we'll read this in class, in the introduction, there is a very strong paragraph about natural rights. And that does not equate to who ends up gaining natural rights or being able to exercise their natural rights in the new nation that forms. And we know that Thomas Jefferson owned hundreds of slaves. And so when you've got the contradictions that go with this giant intellectual who writes the Declaration of Independence, but has these areas within his life that are very different from what he is stating that he believes. And we'll investigate that further when we get into Thomas Jefferson. But for this particular discussion of the Declaration of Independence, it was a giant document that will be used as the foundation for the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and all of the others that will follow. So, and here it is on the printing press, distributed widely among the colonies. They read it out loud, and people immediately began to go. In New York City, when they read out the Declaration of Independence, this mob of people went down to the Bowling Green down by the harbor, and they pulled down the statue of the king that was there in the harbor. And the revolution began. So let me stop sharing. So there it is, chapter 5. We began with the French and Indian War, where the colonists met together under the suggestion of Benjamin Franklin, saying we need to work together as a unit, we need to work together as a unit. Let's think back to that Iroquois Confederation. Didn't he also talk about the natives who had a similar type of alliance as being very wise? But nobody paid attention back then. But then things progressively got worse, and that's when the Declaration of Independence was eventually signed and the Revolutionary War began. In chapter 6, we will look at the war and the negotiations that took place afterwards in the new government that is created.